My brothers and sisters, I came to tell somebody today, you might be in a dry place, a lonely place, a place where you feel like you are walking through a wilderness with no end in sight. You've been crying out, God, where are you? You've been searching for answers, but all you hear is silence. But I need you to hear me today. Just because God is silent does not mean he is absent. The wilderness is not a punishment. It's a proving ground. It's the place where God takes you away from distractions, from false comforts, from crutches you've been leaning on for too long, so that you can learn to lean on him. Ask the children of Israel. God brought them out of Egypt, but before he took them into the promised land, he had to take them through the wilderness. Why? Because sometimes you're not ready for the promise until you've been prepared in the process. The wilderness is a proving ground, not a punishment. Too often we mistake difficult seasons in life as signs that we have done something wrong, that we have been forgotten by God, or that we are being punished. But God does not take his people through the wilderness to destroy them. He takes them through to develop them. The wilderness is not about breaking you, it is about building you. It is the place where faith is tested, where hearts are purified, and where strength is forged. When the Israelites were delivered from Egypt, they did not go straight into the promised land. Instead, they found themselves in a dry, barren place, a place of uncertainty and discomfort. But God had a purpose in leading them there. They had spent generations in slavery, living under the rule of Pharaoh, depending on Egypt's system to provide for them. Now, God had to shift their mindset. He had to teach them that he alone was their source, that he alone was their provider, and that their destiny was in his hands, not Pharaoh's. The wilderness is where God removes crutches. It is where he strips away every false sense of security so that we can learn to depend on him fully. Sometimes we rely too much on our jobs, our relationships, or even our own abilities. We think that as long as we have these things, we are secure. But when God takes us through the wilderness, he allows us to experience seasons where those things are no longer enough. He allows us to walk through situations where our strength is not enough, where our wisdom is not enough, where our connections are not enough, so that we can finally realize that he is enough. The wilderness forces us to put our faith into action. It is one thing to say we trust God when everything is going well, when the bank account is full, when the doors are opening. But real trust is built when you are in a dry place, when you don't know how you will make it, when every door seems closed and you still say, Lord, I trust you. God does not waste the wilderness. Every moment, every struggle, every unanswered question is part of his divine process. He is not taking you through this season for nothing. He is strengthening you, stretching you, preparing you for what is next. If you are in a wilderness season, don't see it as punishment, see it as preparation, because when God is done with you, you will not come out the same. You will come out refined, you will come out stronger, and you will come out ready to step into the promise that he has for you. God is silent but not absent. One of the most challenging parts of the wilderness is the silence of God. When you are struggling, when you are desperate for direction, when you are crying out for answers, and all you hear is silence, it can feel like God has abandoned you. But the truth is, God's silence does not mean his absence. Just because you don't hear him does not mean he is not working. In fact, some of God's greatest work in your life happens in the quiet seasons, when it seems like nothing is happening. The teacher is always silent during the test, and the wilderness is a test of faith. Will you still trust God when you don't feel him? Will you still believe in his promises when you don't see evidence of them? The enemy wants you to believe that silence means rejection, that God has turned his back on you, that he no longer cares. But in reality, the silence is often where God is doing his deepest work within you. Think about Joseph. He was thrown into a pit by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned. There were years where it seemed like God had forgotten about him, but In the silence, God was preparing him for something greater. In one moment, Joseph went from the prison to the palace. What looked like silence was actually divine positioning. The same is true for you. Just because you don't see movement does not mean God is not moving. Just because you don't hear his voice does not mean he is not speaking through your situation. Sometimes God is quiet because he wants you to lean in closer. He wants you to dig deeper, to trust him on a level you never have before. His silence is not a sign of his absence. It is an invitation to grow. When Jesus hung on the cross, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In that moment, even the Son of God felt the weight of God's silence, but that silence was not abandonment, it was part of the plan. 3 days later, Jesus rose in victory, proving that even when God is silent, he is still in control. You may be in a season where you feel like God is distant, but hold on. His silence is not the end of your story. It is a setup for what he is about to do in your life. Keep trusting, keep believing, and know that even when you can't hear him, he is still right there with you. You must learn to trust God alone. One of the greatest lessons of the wilderness is that God is teaching you to depend on him and him alone. Many times we unknowingly place our trust in things, people, or circumstances instead of fully trusting in God. We think our security is in our jobs, our finances, our relationships, or even our own abilities. But the wilderness strips away every false sense of security, forcing us to lean entirely on God. When the children of Israel were in Egypt, they depended on Pharaoh's system for their survival. Even though they were enslaved, they knew where their food would come from, they knew their routine, and they had a sense of stability, even if it was in bondage. But when God brought them out, he had to teach them a new way of living. No longer could they depend on Pharaoh. They had to depend. The wilderness is designed to separate you from everything you thought you needed so that you can realize God is all you need. That is why certain relationships fall apart in this season. That is why the things you used to rely on no longer seem to work. That is why doors that once opened easily now seem locked. It is because God is trying to remove every crutch so that you learn how to stand on faith alone. He is teaching you that your provision does not come from a paycheck. It comes from him. He is showing you that your peace does not come from people. It comes from him. He is proving to you that your strength does not come from your own efforts. It comes from him. The wilderness is painful because it requires surrender. It requires you to let go of your plans, your expectations, and your timeline, and trust that God knows what he is doing. When Elijah was in the wilderness, God sent ravens to feed him. He had no grocery store, no job, no resources, just a word from God that he would provide, and God did. When the brook dried up, God sent him to a widow who had almost nothing, yet God multiplied her little into more than enough. This is what God does in the wilderness. He teaches you to trust in him beyond what you can see, beyond what you can calculate, beyond what makes sense. The wilderness may be uncomfortable, but it is where God reveals himself as your true provider. And once you learn to trust him alone, nothing can shake you because you know that no matter what happens, God is still in control. Even Jesus went through the wilderness. If the Son of God had to endure a season of testing in the wilderness, then we should not be surprised when we go through it as well. Before Jesus began his public ministry, before he performed miracles, before he preached to the multitudes, he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. It wasn't the devil that took him there, it was the Spirit of God. That alone tells us that the wilderness is not a mistake. It is not always the enemy attacking. Sometimes God himself will lead you into a wilderness season because he is preparing you for something great. For 40 days and 40 nights, Jesus fasted and prayed alone in the wilderness. He was hungry, weak in the flesh, and vulnerable. And that is when the enemy showed up. The devil did not come when Jesus was strong. He came when he was weak. That is how the enemy works. He waits until you are tired, discouraged, and questioning everything before he whispers lies into your ear. He tells you that God has forgotten you, that your suffering is pointless, that you are wasting your time trusting in God. He tempted Jesus the same way. He told him to turn stones into bread, trying to get him to take matters into his own hands instead of waiting on God's provision. He told him to throw himself down and prove that he was the Son of God, trying to make him doubt his identity. He even offered him the kingdoms of the world if he would bow down and worship him, attempting to get Jesus to take a shortcut to glory instead of following God's plan. But Jesus overcame every temptation by standing on the word of God. He did not argue with the devil. He did not try to prove anything. He simply responded with, "It is written." That is the key to surviving the wilderness. When the enemy comes with his lies, you have to stand on what God has already spoken. When he says you are alone, you declare, "It is written, God will never leave me nor forsake me." When he says you will never make it, you declare, "It is written, no weapon formed against me shall prosper." The wilderness is not about whether or not you feel strong. It is about whether or not you know the truth. Jesus came out of the wilderness in power, ready to fulfill his purpose. If you hold on, if you trust in God's word, God provides even in the dry places. One of the greatest fears in the wilderness is the fear of lack. The fear that you won't have enough, that you won't make it, that your needs won't be met. The enemy loves to use this fear against you, making you question whether God will truly come through. But the wilderness is not a place of abandonment. It is a place where God's provision is revealed in miraculous ways. The children of Israel faced this fear when they wandered through the desert. There was no food, no water, no resources in sight. They panicked, they complained, and they even wished they could go back to Egypt because at least there they knew where their next meal would come from. But what they failed to realize was that God had already made provision for them. He sent manna from heaven, food they had never seen before, a supernatural supply that came daily. He caused water to flow from a rock, bringing refreshment from an impossible place. He sustained them for 40 years, so much so that their clothes and shoes never wore out. Every single day, he provided exactly what they needed, no more and no less, teaching them to trust him one day at a time. That is the lesson of the wilderness. God may not show you everything at once, but he will always give you what you need for today. Think about Elijah when he was hiding by the brook during a famine. He had no food, no farm, no store to buy from. But God sent ravens, unclean birds, to bring him bread and meat every morning and every evening. Then, when the brook dried up, God had already prepared a widow to provide for him, even though she thought she had nothing left to give. God's provision does not depend on earthly resources. He is not limited by what you see. He can use anything, anyone, any circumstance to sustain you. Some people think that if they are in the wilderness, it means they have to suffer without help. But God always provides for his people. The problem is we often expect provision to come the way we are used to. We want it to come through a job, through a raise, through something familiar. But God doesn't always do things the way we expect. He can send provision in ways you never imagined, through people you never considered, in moments you never planned. Just because you don't see how doesn't mean God won't do it. He is still Jehovah Jireh, your provider, even in the driest places of your life. All you have to do is trust that he will make a way where there seems to be no way. You will come out stronger. The wilderness is not meant to destroy you, it is meant to prepare you. Too often we focus on the hardship of the wilderness rather than the transformation that takes place because of it. When God allows you to go through a season of struggle, isolation, or testing, it is never without purpose. He is refining you, strengthening you, and molding you into the person he has called you to be. The trials you face in the wilderness are not there to break you, but to build you. You may feel weak, but in reality, God is making you stronger than you have ever been before. Look at what happened to the Israelites. They entered the wilderness as former slaves, but they came out as warriors. In Egypt, they were bound, oppressed, and powerless. They had been told what to do, where to go, and how to live. But by the time they reached the promised land, they were no longer the same people. Through the wilderness, they had learned to trust God. They had seen his provision, his protection, and his power. They had faced enemies and overcome them. They had witnessed miracles that proved God was with them. The wilderness transformed them from a fearful people into a strong nation, ready to possess the land God had promised them. The same thing happens in your life. When you first enter the wilderness, you may feel weak, unprepared, and unsure of yourself. You may feel like giving up because the journey seems too hard. But as you walk through it, you begin to develop spiritual endurance. Your faith grows. You learn to trust God in ways you never did before. You stop depending on your own strength and start relying on him completely. Every trial, every challenge, and every obstacle is shaping you into someone who is stronger, wiser, and more equipped for the next season of your life. Even Jesus came out of the wilderness stronger. When he was led into the wilderness, he went in fasting and alone. But when he came out, he was filled with power. The wilderness prepared him for his ministry. It was after the wilderness that he began performing miracles, healing the sick, casting out demons, and fulfilling his purpose. The same is true for you. This season you are going through is not the end. It is the preparation for what is coming next. And when you come out, you won't just survive, you will thrive. You will come out bolder, more anointed, more confident, and ready to walk in the fullness of what God has planned for you.